What do you think the Cold War is?
Currently?
In general.
General?
In general and currently if you want. So
The Cold War was us against Russia with our nukes. We had them pointed at each other, just waiting for something to happen.
Right. Okay. What is your opinion on the Cold War and the current relations between the Americans and the Russians?
Well, as a kid growing up, the thought of the whole, whether whoever pulled the trigger on the nuclear wars was a scary thought.
Mm-hmm.
But now I think that as I've grown older, it doesn't concern me like it used to.
Right. What would you like to see done about the current relations with the Russians and the Americans?
Oh, I don't think we should be buddies with, as long as Putin is president.
Right.
We shouldn't have any relationship with the Russians.
Right. So what do you think the Cold War is?
The Cold War was a conflict between America and the Soviet Union, but it was not a direct conflict between the two. So they had many proxy wars like Vietnam, Korea, Iran, others. A bit of Cuba, some of that. Not really proxy war, but you know what I mean. And it was just kind of a stalemate between the U.S. and Russia, determining who's gonna use nuclear weapons first. How much more info am I supposed to give?
You don't really have to. It was just what you know about it. You honestly gave a lot.
I could keep going.
No.
Okay, so the Bay of Pigs fiasco in Cuba was when the Americans were a bunch of dunces. And we thought, yeah, let's help some rebels win back Cuba, but let's just not really actually help them. And then the Cubans looked really cool and good because they won. And then during the time, there was also East-West Germany and then East-West Berlin, and that was huge. And there was, who was it? Who was the president that said tear down that wall?
Reagan?
Reagan said tear down that wall, and then Gorbachev tore down the wall. Gorbachev was like kind of the end of the Cold War because he was like, yeah, capitalism's not too bad. Kind of like Deng Xiaoping in China.
Oh, okay.
I like Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah. Okay.
He's my favorite.
What's your opinion on the Cold War and relations between the Russians and the Americans today?
So I think the Cold War was interesting. I think it was a cool part of history where we can examine how development happens and how different nations of different socioeconomic status have a role in the world, and how, that America and Russia both are these great nations, right? And they were able to say, let's not fight ourselves. Let's go into Vietnam. Let's go into Korea. Let's go into Iran. And let's just have all these locals kill each other for our stupid ideologies. And let's just say, and America says, yeah, we support an authoritarian government because they like capitalism. And Russia says, yeah, we support an authoritarian government because they support communism. And it's like the whole domino effect thing the Americans said. And it's just kind of, I think that's an interesting aspect of human psychology, how the civilians view those perspectives differently than the heads of government.
Now, what do you think about it today?
I think Americans and Russians, obviously situations have grown more tense since the Ukrainian war. But I think a lot of Russians have anti-Western sentiments because they have a strong sense of nationalism, and they very strongly believe in the culture and society prevalent in Russia, and they really want to bring back the strong men, and they think, as many of those types of nations have, that Western ideologies have grown soft and that Western nations are soft. And they can look at America and they can say they like gay people, and they don't, they can be anti that. And then you can look at like the protests in the Orthodox Church. What's the name of the girls? whatever their names were, the ski mask girls, how the Russian public didn't agree with what they were doing, even though they didn't agree with the response of the Russian government to what they were doing. They nonetheless didn't believe that those girls should be doing what they're doing. And so you can still see that the Russian people support Putin, that the Russian people want a strong nation, that they are anti-Western, that they believe in the strength of Russia. And so that's very different from American sentiments, which have grown. One would say our nationalism is weaker recently, that we are that a lot of people are focused on a globalist aspect of helping other nations, of being more unified with like less developed nations. And so I think that there's very much a culture clash between between the Eastern Russia and the Western countries that America associates with.
What laws or policies should be developed to, I guess, ease the tensions of the Americans and the Russians today?
I don't think there should be policies developed. I think that at the moment,
what should
Russia,
be done? What do you think could be done?
Russia is pursuing policy that goes against the core of many Americans' beliefs. And so, as a whole, America says, I mean, the policy I would say would be to stop Russia from doing what they're doing and somehow get Putin removed from office, and maybe invite Ukraine into the European Union, into NATO, because they obviously associate with Western nations and want the support of us. I mean, I'm talking more Ukraine war now, but I think that to ease tensions, if you want to ease tensions and you want to give in to what Russia's doing, then you could just stop with the tariffs, and you could stop with all the trade blocks against them.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so the Cold War was a political conflict between the Americans and the Russians. It ranged from just after World War II to early 1990s to 1991ish, and essentially it was more of like a technological battle and fighting for political ideology in certain nations. So for instance, like the proxy wars, like Eli had mentioned, like Vietnam, Iran. I think he said Iran. I think Iran's one of them. Vietnam's a big one though. Korea, I believe, was one as well. But anyways, there was a bunch of these wars that, like, any actual fighting between the two happened in these nations that were deciding whether or not they wanted to be either a capitalist nation or a communist nation. And the Americans were the capitalists and the Russians were the communists. And basically, all these different American and Russian leaders were pointing the nukes at each other, and they were, I guess there were threats. There was always a global, like, thought of a nuclear war, and people were afraid of that, which is why it's called the Cold War. Never really got hot, as that's like the whole thing. It's like it's cold, so it never got hot. And those tensions were present throughout all of the 80s, 70s, 60s, all those years. And the Red Scare was a big part. The Red Scare was essentially all the Americans thought they were a bunch of spies. Like, they could hear you through your phone. It's the Russians, you know, which is crazy because they were allies in World War II. But that's beside the point. I'm just thinking a lot. My mind's moving a million hours right now. Million miles an hour. There we go. So a big thing that I think represents this war is that the 1980 Miracle on Ice game was seen as like almost like a weird victory for the Americans because they beat the Russians in a game of hockey, which is crazy because that has nothing to do with any political affair whatsoever. East Berlin, West Berlin, they were divided in Germany, and there was a wall, and they tore it down, like Eli mentioned. See, that's the thing. Eli's just said so much, I can't explain any of this. Anyways, so as far as it goes today, the tension between the Americans and the Russians still stands. Putin wants to bring back the communist state of Russia, which is seen present in the Ukraine. He wants to rebuild the Soviet Union, essentially. And so essentially we're still in a Cold War era, which is really, I don't know. See, it's interesting, but it's also scary because we're still pointing nukes at each other. Like we're still trying to be one nation's trying to be the bigger kid on the block, I guess. You know, put the whole idea is like there's these two big kids on the block. You know, they're gonna fight at some point. Like that's the idea, and it's scary because like for this day and age, a nuclear war is devastating. Like nobody's living through it. Like it's just crazy that's the circumstances that we're living under. Is that if the Russians and the Americans fight today, or if they fought back in the 80s, it just annihilation, man. And it's just wild, and that is a reason why we should care about it today for sure, as it's a scary thing. And with the Ukrainians being attacked by the Russians right now and pushing back, there's always a thought that Putin might actually use a nuclear strike, which would put us, it gives us a tough decision. And then you have China, who's also trying to push in Taiwan, another sort of trying to take back territory that was once theirs, and another country that is very capable of nukes. It's a very scary situation, and we need to keep a close eye on all of it. As though the Cold War era is over, we're not out of the Cold War yet, because like the only thing that ended was the Soviets. That's it. There wasn't the Russians are still the Russians. They're still communists. A bunch of Russians still support Putin. Putin is still a very, very big leader, very, very pivotal, important leader to the Russians. And it's very, very scary. And that's why we should care about it and why the Cold War is so important. Not to mention, a lot of space advancements came from the Cold War because the Americans and the Russians were fighting on who could get to the moon first, or not even the moon, just space, who could explore space first. They were trying to, it's called the space race. They were trying to get the upper hand, like a technological, like anything that the Americans or the Russians could say they were better at than the other side was a huge win to them. And I feel like that's exactly what we're getting to now, because like you look at everything, like it's crazy. Anyways, that's the video. Hopefully I explained enough. And yeah.